Hello, listeners. I'm Anna Grgić, Birth Institute Fellow from Croatia. Before I begin my talk, I would like to thank those organizations that encourage me to pursue my field of interest. So, first and foremost, I would like to thank Birth Institute for selecting me to become a fellow and also for giving me this opportunity to present my work at Central European Talk. I would also like to thank Croatian Science Foundation as well as Faculty of Philosophy and Religious Studies at University of Zagreb. And last but not least, I would like to thank Institute of Philosophy in Zagreb. The topic of my talk is narrative self. So, what is narrative self? Well, behind the idea of narrative self is our alleged understanding of ourselves as storytellers. We are all storytellers, as Daniel Dennett put it, and it basically makes up what we essentially are. While I'm questioning that idea, and while I'm doing that, I do have strong institutional support, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I have professional support. Briefly put, I was recently told that there is nothing more to be said about narrative self, and that I should give up on that project, since it is an old, obsolete subject matter that served its purpose, since after all it is on the philosophical market for about 40 years or a little bit more than 40 years. I believe that comment that I was given can be interpreted in two different ways, implicit and explicit. Implicitly, the comment suggested that there is no real improvement in philosophy, since someone before us, or in this case before me, has said everything that was needed or required. And the question then is, what can I do to add value to the debate that was going on for quite a while? Well, I'm adding a value by continuing with my second interpretation of that comment, which is explicit. And explicitly, the interpretation goes like this. If we don't need notion of narrative self because it is outdated and because it has served its purpose, then we've stumbled upon something that we should not let go of, since it has purpose. Purpose does not get outdated. And the purpose of narrative self is to bring meaning to our beliefs, motives, actions, desires, and so on. So, purpose of narrative self in its most generally outlined form is to bring us understanding of ourselves in form of narrative or a story. And if this interpretation seems plausible, then we should give the notion of narrative self, we should grant the notion of narrative self such a privileged status of being a type of notion that never goes out of fashion. And just because I've said the basic outline of a notion of narrative self doesn't mean that I've said what it actually is. And I will probably disappoint you now by saying that there is no single notion of narrative self. Its meaning really depends on its uses within different philosophical debates. So there is no single notion of narrative self, and it may sound a bit frustrating, but if you put your mind to it, it really isn't, because we are complex beings and we have different sorts of problems, or even the same types of problems in different times, and we address them accordingly. And narrative self is a type of solution that really depends on its usage in specific debate. Said narrative self comes as a solution to many different and diverse philosophical problems, and that is why there is no single notion of narrative self. Therefore, it comes in different shades and different colors, so the most problems, I should probably say different colors and shades. Anyhow, in philosophy, debates where narrative self emerges are related to debates about personal identity, moral responsibility, autonomy, autobiographical memory, and anticipation. And I will only roughly glance over two types of debate, and namely personal identity and autonomy. So from the perspective of personal identity, that is its appearance in debates about personal identity, narrative self can either be an entity who is the same as person, or it can be description that people give to themselves in order to explain themselves. It can also be an useful fiction that our brain is creating in order to do basically the same things as I previously mentioned. And it can also mean just psychological organization of our mental states and mental repertoire that is driven and dependent on our memory. So varieties of narrative self may seem endless because its meaning really depends on different uses within different debates, where it aims to be as a solution. And if we follow the reasoning or view that narrative self is the same as person, then we follow this type of reasoning. Narrative self is created in human interaction, or better said, it is created in human transaction. Human transaction is a social exchange that is dependent on dialogue, it is dependent on articulation, and basically boils down to narrative. And in this type of setting, narrative self is born. Articulation then seems the right way in which our thoughts and feelings and actions can become comprehensible or intelligible. After all, narrative nature is ingrained in all of us, and if we follow this type of reasoning even further, then we'll see that narrative setting implies narrative thinking that is dependent on narrative structure. And what it basically does is that it combines those two ideas, and it seems that narrative is, on the one hand, inseparable part of our nature, and on the other hand, its structure gives us something what we need. And the thing that we need is coherence. We need unity of our life, and narratives can provide that. If narratives can shed a light on our sensibilities and give us a sense of who we are, then they seem pretty much important. That idea that narratives give us something, that they make something for us, combined with the idea that narratives are part of human nature, has been fostered for many, many decades now. And it basically made narrative structure and the way we think about ourselves intertwined and inseparable. And I only want to briefly point out why it was coined like that, why it was designed as so. So it was designed as an opposition of me, solely me thoughts. It was an opposition of inward type of thinking or self-reflecting thoughts. And as I mentioned, really narrative self and meaning of that notion depends on the context in which it's being used. And we should always be mindful of that and of the background story that surrounds any notion, not just notion of narrative self. If we shift our attention to the debates about personal autonomy and anticipation, then we will see that narrative self is being used as a reflexive guise, where it appears as a way in which we appear to ourselves when being involved in planning and practical reasoning. There, in those debates, narrative self boils down to the importance of first-person perspective, and also the way in which it functions. So first-person perspective within that debate is important because it connects not just how we appear to ourselves, but how we would like to appear to ourselves if we take necessary steps, and necessary steps imply forming an intention and basically executing that intention. So narrative self tracks what we think about ourselves, what we do, and what we wish to do, and what we would like to think about ourselves in a form of an I thought that is able to account of our deeds and mental states. And with all that being said, we can conclude that narrative self can either have this metaphysical burdening around itself if we claim that narrative self is the same as person, which basically means that we are stories that we make and tell about ourselves. It can also be metaphysically unburdening if we just claim that narrative self is a type of self-reflection that gives a sense of who we are, or if we just consider it to be a narrative way of thinking of ourselves. But either way, there is something problematic in that views, and that is that narrative is being emphasized a little bit too much. So narrative is a form of explanation. It guarantees us coherence. It guarantees us coherence of our lives. And the only problem with that is that we rely too much on narrative, and it doesn't give us the whole story, so to say. So what I'm proposing is to depart from the idea that narratives do so much stuff for us, that they can make something for us. And instead, I suggest that we should think in terms that narratives are important for us. They do have impact on us, but they also have impact on us when we are able to use them and when we choose to use them as a means of self-expression or just expression. So what I'm suggesting is to consider narrative as a tip of the iceberg, an argument that could support my claim and my suggestion. Basically, my suggestion, because I'm not making any claim, can be found in clearer distinction between narrative thinking and narrative structure. What I'm suggesting is that human nature is much more wider than the narrative structure, and if we make clearer distinction of that, then we are heading towards another 40 years of fruitful debates. So yeah, I think that with that being said, we do need to make clear distinction. We need that distinction, and we have to do the actual distinction. So we are heading towards new narratives about narrative self, and we have a lot of work in front of us. And with that all being said, I will just briefly summarize what I've said so far. So there is no single notion of narrative self. Its meaning depends within the philosophical debates where it is being used. And I also believe that it is incomplete if we don't separate our nature from the narrative structure. And when we do so, then we'll get a new set of arguments. Thank you for watching.